Welcome in. We are the Bourbon Brothers, and this is the Liquid Courage Show. We have a great show planned for you tonight, but first, I want to welcome the other half of the Bourbon Brothers, my brother from another mother, my co-pilot in this four-wheel slide we call a show. Ken, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, John?
I'm excellent, and I can't wait to dig into everything we have to discuss tonight. So let's just get to it. If you're new to the show, the format's simple. First, we're going to kick things off with a tasting and discussion of a spirit, usually a bourbon, and we will continue to enjoy said spirit throughout the remainder of the show. As for the remainder of the show, we'll focus on a specific episode of our favorite television series, where we will start with the pilot, work our way through episode by episode, all the way through to the series finale. Tonight, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 3 of Kurt Sutter's Sons of Anarchy. The episode is titled Funtown. For those of you that are watching the show on YouTube, I want to let you know that we published this show in 3 parts. You're currently watching part 1, so you're in the right place. We're going to cover a bourbon tasting, and then parts 2 and 3 will be the discussion of the episode. So please be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And if you don't want to look at our ugly mugs, or you prefer to listen in the car or the office, you can also subscribe to the podcast version of the show. And you can find that at iTunes, Stitcher, and just about any other favorite location where finer podcasts are available. And finally, we want to hear from you. Please send us your praise, your questions, your hate comms. Let us know how we're doing, what you like, what you dislike, and what you'd like to see more of. You can leave your comments in the comment section below, or you can also email your questions to us at ask@bourbonbros, that's BROS.TV. And if your question doesn't suck, we might even answer it on a future episode. And with that out of the way, let's kick this sucker off. Ken, what are we drinking tonight?
Well, as we selected last week, we're going to go with the Basil Hayden's tonight.
Basil Hayden's. All
Here's
right.
the bottle. Yeah, Basil Hayden's.
One of the best looking bourbon bottles I've seen.
Right. But as you can see, I've had this before. I'm about halfway through this, so I'm glad I have some for tonight. But I'm going to go ahead and crack this and give it a pour.
Let's do it. Let's crack it and pour it. I'll do the same on my side. I think probably the most expensive part of producing this show is the fact that we have to go out and buy our own bottles of bourbon because we're both unable to travel as we try to avoid Tom Jones, What's New Pussycat, being played 21 times in a row everywhere.
Absolutely everywhere.
Now, I'm going to let this sit for just a minute, and I'm going to give you just a couple of like what I like to call the basic download of the details, and then we'll go right into the tasting. So it's classified as a straight bourbon. It comes from the company Beam Suntory, which is Jim Beam Distillery. Release date's ongoing. Now, the biggest kind of aha, if you're not familiar with Basil Hayden's, is that this is an 80 proof bourbon, which is a little bit on the low side. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but it is 80 proof. And the mash bill is 63% corn, 27% rye, and 10% malted barley. Before we lift a glass, the brand Basil Hayden's describes this as to preserve the subtle sophistication that makes it so shareable. Basil Hayden's is aged to the perfect expression of its novel, spicy sweet flavor profile. If that is not flowery marketing speak, I don't know what is.
Wow.
All right. So should we lift a glass and give old Basil a spin here?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Cheers.
Yeah, that's a bourbon.
That's a bourbon.
What's your impressions on this? How would you describe this?
So it's interesting because knowing that it's an 80 proof, it does have a little bit of a weaker taste, but there is actually quite a bit of flavor there. It's a little surprising. There's quite a bit of flavor there.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not surprising. You don't get quite the burn that you get in some of those initial sips of bourbons at a higher proof.
Is that the corn, do you think? Lower on the mash bill, 62%?
I think it's the lower proof.
Just proof in general.
It's basically, there's less alcohol. So let's talk a little bit about it, because this is kind of an interesting bourbon, and with an interesting history. It's one of the 4 bourbons that comprise of Jim Beam's small batch bourbon collection. The others you're probably familiar with: Knob Creek, Baker's Bourbon, and then of course one of my favorites, Booker's.
Oh,
bourbon,
yes, Booker's.
which I'm looking forward to doing on a future show. So this is one of the 4, and if you look at Booker's Bourbon being kind of the high end on the proof spectrum, being a cask strength bourbon, this is on the low end at 80.
Right, and you can taste that.
Yes.
To me, it feels like a little.
To bourbon, or sorry, if you put this next to Booker's, it's a world
like
of
water.
difference.
It's like water. This is a little lighter. You can sense that.
Yeah, and the other 3 bourbons in the small batch collection are all sharing the same mash bill. And so Basil Hayden's is created using Jim Beam's high rye mash bill that's also found in Old Grandad and Old Grandad 114.
Interesting.
Now, one of the things that I find interesting is that the name Basil Hayden's is named after the late master distiller, Basil Hayden, or Basil Hayden Sr., actually, to be more accurate. And he was known for his use of high rye bourbon mash bills. What I found interesting is that this is obviously a way to memorialize Basil Hayden. I found it interesting that they chose to do that on what is essentially a weak or weaker bourbon. And that's not meant to be a slam at Jim Beam. It surprises me that what would be considered more of a bourbon for new bourbon drinkers, that's where they chose, or that's the product they chose to memorialize Basil Hayden's legacy.
Right. I mean, it's not without flavor. It still has a lot of flavor to it. It just, to me, senses maybe it's what last week we sampled Woodford Reserve, and that was, to me, a bit stronger, a little more flavorful.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I think more complexity in the flavor profile for Woodford. And many, I don't know whether Jim Beam and the marketing team at Basil Hayden would necessarily consider this, but in general, the public tend to think of this as more of what would be a gateway bourbon, right? If you're new to drinking bourbon, this is a great one to start with because that lower proof makes it a little easier on the palate. You don't quite get that burn, and it's an easy way to kind of introduce people into bourbon without kind of immediately turning them off with something that has a really high proof. Mm-hmm. And of course, the bottle is also part of the package, if you will. And so you can absolutely see how if this is up on a shelf at a bar, people that don't know their bourbon are probably going to pick this just based on the look of the bottle alone.
Yeah, it's well put together. That band around the bottle. Again, I'll show it.
I love
it's well
what they
done.
refer to as the apron label, right? That goes over the neck of the bottle. That's unique. And then of course you have that band of what looks like some wood veneer with some metal. It's a nice, really nice bottle.
It presents well.
Unfortunately, I mean, the cold hard facts is this bottle of bourbon that's 80 proof sells for, I think, just shy of $40. I think I paid $37 for the bottle.
It's about right. It's about what I paid.
And for an 80 proof bourbon, I think a big chunk of that price is paying for that bottle.
I can see that.
And not necessarily what's inside it.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the comments I found online that I thought was interesting, and it does ring true. Again, this probably is not what I'd want to hear if I was on Basil Hayden's marketing team, but it kind of reminds you of a watered down whiskey, which at 80 proof, in many ways it is. I mean, that's really what this is. And so I think knowing that you and I both prefer our bourbon on ice, the ice is going to water it down a little bit. So the last thing I want to do is start with a weaker bourbon that I'm then going to put on ice. So if I'm going to drink Basil Hayden's, I'm probably going to choose to drink it straight rather than water it down further with ice.
And drink it quickly or soon. Otherwise it might water down.
That's right. That's right. That's one of the reasons I love Booker's. Being a cask strength bourbon, it's perfect for someone like myself who prefers their bourbon on ice, because I can put that cask strength over a nice ice cube and it adds just enough water to really bring out the flavors of the bourbon and take down some of that heat that comes off of the high alcohol content cask strength bourbons.
Do you know if this being lightweight is somewhat intentional? How is this being pulled out of the barrels? Is it sooner than later, perhaps?
So great question. So in terms of how do they achieve the lower proof?
Yeah.
So yes. So first of all, there's kind of two reasons for doing it. One is it actually makes the bourbon less expensive, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But I think they truly are trying to create a bourbon that is easier to drink, specifically for people who may not have developed their taste for bourbon yet. So for new bourbon drinkers, and actually in my research, one of the things that I found was that a lot of the millennials who are now in their younger 20s, they're starting to discover bourbon. A lot of them have really embraced Basil Hayden's as a new bourbon drinker. And I think partly that's the lower proof and the easy drinkability, but I think also it's the appreciation that has gone into the branding and the bottle design. And so this has become very popular with kind of young, new bourbon drinkers. But to get to your question, it really gets into how the bourbon is distilled. So most bourbons will get distilled twice, right? So they'll create the mash, and they'll go through the fermentation process with the yeast. And what they basically have at that point is beer. They then heat that fermented mash so that the alcohol, which has a lower boiling point than water, starts to boil off into vapor. And then they condense that, and that's where the alcohol spirit comes from. They'll generally take that condensed alcohol vapor and do it again, which will pull out more of the impurities and get an even better spirit. But once they've gone through that distillation twice, it is generally higher than 125 proof. It's like pure grain alcohol. And we know that you can't bottle bourbon at any higher than 125 proof. And so when you go through that second distillation, you can get as high as 160 proof. sometimes.
Okay.
So they do what they call proofing the bourbon, which is they have to lower the proof from 160 down to at least 125 before they put it into the barrel. They use water to do that. They dilute it. They dilute the alcohol with water.
So in this case, they're cutting it in half potentially.
Well, not half. They're going to be going from like 160 down to 125.
Oh, I thought we were at 80 proof here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm getting there. But yes.
Okay.
So yes, the end result could be half. You're absolutely right.
Okay. I'm with you.
So they'll first start by going from 160 or so down to 125. Once they're underneath that 125, that's when it will go into the barrels. And oftentimes when they're adding the water, the visual image would be like they're just pouring water in. They actually tend to add a little water, let it kind of interact with the bourbon and settle, add a little more. It tends to be, a lot of distillers prefer to do it slowly because there is a chemical reaction that's happening when you're adding the water. And so they'll tend to do it a little time, test it, little time, test it, until they get it to where it's now ready to be put in the barrels. But now you've got 125 proof going into the barrels. Later, when that bourbon comes out, right, we know Booker's being cask strength, you're getting exactly what's come out of the barrel. Okay. And that proof will vary, which is why one batch of Booker's might be 113 and the next batch might be 115. Okay. It all just depends based on the amount of evaporation that has occurred. But if it's not going to be Booker's and it's going to be Basil Hayden's, they've got to take it from that 113 or 115 down to 80. And so they will do a second proofing, which again is diluting it with water.
Okay.
So let's assume for a minute that they had it at 160. They've added water to get it down to 125. You're essentially right out of the gate in that first proofing, you're getting more bourbon because you're adding water to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Then it's going to come out of the barrel at, let's say, 113, 115, and you're going to add water to get it down to 80. You're going to, again, end up with more bourbon.
All right. Okay.
So by creating a market for an 80 proof bourbon, that bourbon costs you less than the 93 proof bourbon sitting next to it because there's more water in it.
Brilliant.
So it's kind of like when you started to see some beer companies where they started to sell bottles of beer that instead of being 12 ounces, they were like 11 and a half ounces.
Right.
That half ounce over millions of bottles of beer starts to add up to some real money. Mm-hmm. And it's the same kind of shell game here where you're getting the same amount of bourbon, but it has more water, and they've been able to basically spread that distillation out, and they're able to produce more bottles of bourbon with the same amount of liquid because they're adding water to it.
Makes sense. Brilliant move. If any of our 4 listeners out there has any additional facts on that process, feel free to send it our way or our post. We'd love to hear about it.
Yes, and just I've kind of, with this explanation, I've kind of let the cat out of the bag. But last week when we decided to do Basil Hayden's, I left you with a little riddle, which was I was going to tell you why you probably wouldn't drink Basil Hayden's after our show.
That's right.
And more specifically, you wouldn't have it at a bar or a restaurant. And again, not referring to now where you're trying to avoid Tom Jones' What's New Pussycat being played 21 times in a row, but when we can all go back to restaurants and bars, why you wouldn't order it. And the reason for that is, number one, you're basically paying the same amount of money for a watered down whiskey. So you already know you're paying exorbitant rates when you go into a bar or a restaurant. Why would you want to pay that and get weak bourbon? Like, just might as well get the Woodford or something other that it's full strength, right?
Good
so
point.
I don't want to pay that amount of money and get weak bourbon. The other reason I don't think you'd order it is when I go to a restaurant or a bar, unless it's a bar where I'm going with someone like you that we're just going to sit down and have some bourbon. If I'm out with friends or family, I'm generally ordering a cocktail. So now we're talking about adding more things to the drink. I don't want to start with a weak bourbon.
Okay. Right.
So I wouldn't choose Basil Hayden's for cocktails unless, again, you're really wanting to try to remove the taste of alcohol. But I enjoy cocktails where I can still taste the bourbon.
As do I.
But I also said, although I would tell you why you wouldn't necessarily want to drink or order Basil Hayden's, you'd be glad that you have it on your shelf. And the reason for that is if you're enjoying bourbon and you have a friend or a family member that is like, I've never really had bourbon or never really tried bourbon, you want to start them with Basil Hayden's.
That's a good place to start.
Yes. Yes. So having that in your cabinet where you can go to it, it's a great way to introduce someone to bourbon. They're going to love the bottle, right? They're going to know that you're giving them a quality spirit just based on the look of the bottle. And you're going to give them something that's a little easier to drink.
Good point.
So with that, we're going to wrap up part 1. Next, we're going to get into our discussion of Sons of Anarchy, Season 1, Episode 3, titled Funtown. Please remember to like and subscribe. Be sure to check out our channel for more episodes. But most importantly, do top off your glass and join us for part 2. It's all coming up next on the Liquid Courage Show. Stay with us.